Bonjour, tout, bienvenue, messieurs et mesdames, et les filles et fils, and mes amis. Well, I tried. And welcome here to the theater for my last talk. It's my great pleasure to talk about La Belle France, or the beautiful France. And for those of you who have been there, you know how beautiful it is, and it gets more beautiful with every visit. I've had the great pleasure to sail around France, go into most of the ports, and spend quite a bit of time there over the years. My wife is of French origin, so that's where she would like to retire. But I'm still on the move, of course. And I have to say that my family has been involved in France in a sadder way, in that both my grandfather and my father both were wounded on the front, both shed blood into the blood of France to help save France and keep it free as it is today. And so when we go back, I'll show you a little bit of where we're going and some of the history just for your interest. This, of course, is Mont St. Michel, which is on one of the tours all of tomorrow. And, this country, if my clicker will work. There we are. It is quite an unusual geography in the sense that it has the whole western coast of Western Europe, other than Spain here, but it has three distinct coasts. One where we are up in the English Channel, or La Manche, the sleeve, they call it in French, the Bay of Biscay facing the Atlantic, and then the Mediterranean coast, and then the mountains of the Alps. So I had a French friend who once said to me, "Why should we leave France? It has everything you need, from mountains to ski on and beaches to laze on and beautiful countryside." And it's true, it's quite a very variegated country. And then, of course, you can go further out into what is still part of the country of France, which are the départements outre-mer, the overseas parts of France, which are, of course, a couple of islands in the Caribbean, and, of course, Tahiti. So it is a proud and rather large country, about 60 million people. We're just going to Normandy, which is where the Seine on the top right of this portrait, that's the Seine going up to Paris, and then the beaches along Normandy where the invasion of D-Day was. Some of you are going out on that. Well, from above, it looks like this, where you have the incredible sweep of sea coming through the English Channel. And most of the crossings are right there at Dover and Calais, where we started, but you can see we're down in Normandy, that peninsula, at Guernsey, Jersey, the Channel of Islands, and then this is a very rough waters, particularly in the winter, and also has all of these ports which have either been allied or in combat with each other for the centuries. And of course, the English Channel is what protected Britain from being invaded over and over and again. Now, we're going into Le Havre right there. That means the port, literally, in French, but the name is actually Norse. Havre, as in New Haven or something, that actually means the port in the Norse language, which became part of the major port of France in this area. Then we're going to go around Cherbourg and go down to Guernsey in the Channel Islands. Now, this is the French version of the same site with all the names in French, Royaume-Uni, Angleterre, and the Manche, as I say. The French never refer to it as the English Channel. It is their sleeve, as it's called. And so we'll be going, again, to Le Havre and then around to the Anglo-Norman Islands, they call them in French. Now, this body of water where we'll be passing back to Dover is among the world's busiest shipping straits in all the world, only matched by the Straits of Malacca to Singapore. And so we'll see a lot of traffic. This is part of the control scheme to avoid collisions and such. But this whole area has been contested for, again, millennia. Now, this is a medieval era illustration where the green is the Angles and the Saxons from Germany, who then settled into England, and then they were invaded by the Danes, that's the orange, and then the Norwegians, the red. And we saw a bit of this up in the Orkneys and coming around to Ireland even. And then Normandy was settled by Norwegians who became Frenchified. Then they invaded England. So that's why it's a very contested area. Here the Vikings, again, going on their holiday, rowing and sailing up the Seine, and they besieged Paris. And Paris was just what they call the Ile de Cité, the city island, which was fortified and had bridges and controlled the river traffic. But the Vikings came up and laid siege. They were not successful, but they were in a deal with the King Charles the Bald. He gave them Normandy if they would only relent their attacks on the rest of France. and that's why Normandy was established and then continues to this day. Of course, this is the great Bayeux tapestry that illustrates the invasion of William the Conqueror across the Channel to conquer England and establish the Norman rule, which in some ways continues to this day. Here they are making a boat. For hundreds of years, the official language of Great Britain was Norman. And this was sort of a blend of French and Norse that then became infused with English and made the kind of polyglot language that English is today, but it had to be translated into vernacular English. Well, I'll skip ahead a few centuries to the most recent conflict, which of course was World War II, and the Norman coast all the way up to Dunkirk and all the way down to Saint-Malo coast was highly fortified with defenses and offensive capabilities to invade Britain, and these are mostly still there. This is a German air chart to determine the distance to go and bomb Britain during the Great Air War, the World War II. So these are wounds that are still somewhat fresh, but you can still see along the coast of Normandy the great watchtowers and emplacements, matched on the other side by other emplacements. But this is, I put this in just because this is a symbol of hope in the city of Portsmouth as the great Spinnaker Tower about the peaceful relations between the continent and Britain. Well, until Britain, of course, pulls further away in the vote next week. But as we sail into Normandy and Havre, this is the look of the port here. It's on a high bluff, and this was an important fortification and port city that was built for the French Navy, both for defense and offense. And in the Napoleonic Wars, it was blockaded by the Royal Navy, the so-called wall of wood that protected Britain from the invading Napoleonic forces. Well, now it's all a modern city. This is the new Pont de Normandie across the Seine at the mouth. And of course, this river goes up about 100 kilometers, winding its way into the heart of Paris. So here's Le Havre. Now, this city was founded, it's not that new a town. It had an original fishing village and such, but as a major port, it was decided under Francois I to build a fortified port for the Navy, and it has a natural harbor that's been extended. We'll be docking on the upper left-hand side. There's a lot of modern docks, and we'll be at one of them. And then the downtown is behind fortifications and then a grid format. Unfortunately, much of this town was bombarded in World War II, and so there's only some historical monuments left. Here was the founder of Le Havre in the modern area, Francois I. But there's some historical buildings left are reconstructed: City Hall, Park, the Hotel de Ville, the mayor's office, some of the ship merchants' houses. The cathedral was rebuilt. But what happened was much of this was in rubble and has been built. The upper right hand is the Graville Abbey, which dates from the 800s, and that's the oldest building just outside of town that survived the terrible war. This is the cathedral, which was reconstructed because in spite of the, let's say, the grace of the French, this was a town that took a lot of demolition in World War II. In French culture, though, it's famous for being a town where the writers would go to the seaside. The favorite son of Le Havre is Benedicte Saint-Pierre, who wrote journals about the sea and adventure and such. And Monet came to paint here. This is his sunrise painting of the harbor. And most famously, this ship was built nearby at Saint-Nazaire, the Great Normandy, which at the time was the largest and fastest ship in the world for the transatlantic liner trade. Now, this was the pride of Le Havre and also of France, and said to be the most elegant ship ever built at the time in 1933. It actually looks a little bit like the Disney Magic, doesn't it? Just doesn't have Goofy on it. Well, this was a tremendous ship that had the world record for crossing the Atlantic. And during the outbreak of World War II, it sailed out of Le Havre, here it is, on its maiden voyage over to New York, where it came in, and made a number of crossings. And then when the Vichy French government established itself in collaboration with the Germans, Normandy happened to be in New York, so it was seized and getting ready to become a troop ship. It was renamed the Lafayette in honor of Marquis de Lafayette, and it was sabotaged, they think, or else it was just an industrial accident that it burnt and then rolled over, caught in the ice in the winter of 1942, and then was a sad wreck of itself. So this was a tremendous loss at the time, much regretted by the French. Well, that was one of the tolls of the Great War, of which there's a lot of evidence around in this area, alas. But this was downtown Le Havre in 1945. So they just show you this for those who don't remember how terrible the war was. But like a miracle, the city has been rebuilt, has a lot of the historical monuments replaced, and then modern architecture has come in to fill up some of the void. This is the library of the local university. Here it is today. So it's the scars of war are pretty much healed at this point, and the harbor is busy. And we're going there essentially to go to Paris and to go to the beaches of Normandy and to go out to Mont St, for instance. Now, this is another excursion to Honfleur, which is a small medieval port just down the coast from Le Havre. And it maintains its medieval buildings and its little inner port. And so this is a very charming excursion to go see part of France, which is preserved in very good stead and has its shop merchants' houses rising around the waterfront. And again, it's a favorite haunt for artists. This is the house of Erik Satie, the French composer, which has a wonderful exhibit of his life in it, if you know the musician. And unusually, it has Norwegian-style stave churches and wooden buildings. And so this is a little bit of the, let's say, the Norse inheritance that is still remaining in Normandy. Here's the Église, the main church, which is a Norwegian-style stave church, very beautifully constructed, about 500 years old. Now I'll move on to Guernsey. That's in the Channel Islands. Then we'll be that the day after we leave Le Havre and on our way to Dover. Now these are, again, a contested little archipelago of islands that have remained part of the United Kingdom in spite of occupation by the Germans in World War II and disputes with the French government as why does Britain have islands within sight of the French coast. Well, the local people are a mixture of French and English, but they are very proudly part of Britain, and part of that arrangement is that they are independent locally, but above all, they are tax havens. So you have some of the islands like Sark that is owned privately, but we can get to go visit. There's an excursion there also. The ship will dock at St. Peter Port. But this is sort of an unusual, almost tropical islands in the middle of the English Channel. Well, not too tropical in the winter, but it's known for balmy weather and fairer weather than, let's say, north in the mainland of Britain. So here's Guernsey. It's a rocky crag that is built over with the town itself, and then a lot of farms and little villages. So again, it's a small but a charming place, and you can go out into the hills and see the farmland and the sheep and the various cattle. But its symbol is the 3 lions of King Richard, my ancestor. And it has a castle, which is probably on the tour, this tremendous redoubt that was built over the centuries and last occupied by the Germans, and then now it has a museum and armament still in it. Pardon. But the shore is very rocky. There are little beaches, but the whole area is very hazardous for sailors because it has tremendous tides, up to 15 meters. There's almost 50 foot of tide in some places. So this was an area where you had to have local knowledge, and other visitors were often at the hazard of all of the tides and the rocks. Upland, you have very lush land, and above all, you have some of the inhabitants, the famous Guernsey cattle, which are famously high productive for milk. Something about the salt air on the grass makes them moo especially well. And now they've been exported around the world. So you see Guernsey cows around the world for dairy production. And you can buy one, but you're not allowed to take it on board your carry-on baggage. Wouldn't you like one at home? Well, anyway, this is St. Peter Port, which again is somewhat of a medieval town. It doesn't have that very much new, and it was spared destruction in World War II, and it has shops, and it's sort of an Anglo-French style of various buildings, and a beautiful little market in the center of town. You can walk around the town in 10, 15 minutes, and then there are buses out into the countryside or around the whole island, however you take a tour. Here's the watchtower overlooking the harbor. Again, this harbor is subject to tremendous tides. The classic phone booths and post boxes with ER Elizabeth Regina. And I'll show you the other neighbor, Jersey, because I know some people are from New Jersey. Now you really should know about where your ancestors came from. So this is just next to Guernsey, and it similarly has what they call a floating harbor, where the tide comes in and picks up all the boats, and then they have a lock that closes it so that you can be floating even where other boats would be aground in the mudflats. So this is, again, a boating center. This is just like Guernsey, with a few beaches between the rocks and some medieval castles from the days of yore. This is Gorée, and then this is the oldest building, the Hermitage, which was a meditation center for monks at the time. And more modern Victorian buildings. And Jersey is its own, let's say, self-governing like the rest of the Channel Islands. So it issues its own stamps of adventures around the world. Nowadays, it's mostly a holiday home place, or they're offshore banking, and then visitors like us. But the language is very curious, because on the Channel Islands, Guernsey and Jersey, they speak a different kind of French, English, kind of mix, so you can't really understand it. But you'll see the signs are in French and English. Many of the visitors are from France, of course, because it's so close. There are ferries to Saint-Malo, an area. I have a particular interest in this area just because I visited there a number of times now. And here's a BBC in Guernsey, which is the local language. So this is the extent of Britain extends to this area, which is very much mixed with French. And if you have time in the summer, there are beautiful beaches, a lot of tide, though. And again, it was a vacation place for artists. This is one of the scenes on the shore of Guernsey. and some of the local inhabitants pardon, include Lily Langtry, the famous opera singer, Victor Hugo, the great writer in French, and then Chateaubriand, the great writer of French cuisine, is buried there on the shores of Guernsey. And they have their self-administrating parliament. They call the Assises, l'Hermitage, and they have the local representative of the Queen there. Now, this is the governor of Guernsey coming in for a meeting, and so we may not see this, but the pomp and circumstance of Britain is still there on these Channel Islands. Now, I happen to be volunteer skipper of this historic boat, which was built in 1924 and was a ferry boat between Jersey, Guernsey, Plymouth, and Saint-Malo, and they would take 10-hour sail crossings of the English Channel on a broad reach, beating back and forth across the channel. And some friends of mine found this sunk in the Connecticut River about 10 years ago, and we raised it and we rebuilt it. Now it is ready for sea again, and it's floating right now in the Mystic River near Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. And tomorrow, day after tomorrow, I'm meeting with the local Channel Islands Heritage Trust to arrange to give the boat back to the historic trust, because it's one of the little ships that was mobilized for the evacuation of British troops, not at Dunkirk, but at Saint-Malo in the Western Channel. And so it is registered as a wounded veteran of the Royal Navy from 1940, but it's one of the few that is actually floating and operational. So here's my son working with me to run the little ship. And so this is of great interest to them here, because they just had the 75th anniversary of the end of German occupation, and this very boat took British troops off, laden on it. It was strafed by the Luftwaffe, but it somehow survived and continued and sailed across the pond, and now we're going to either sail it or ship it back. So if any of you are looking for a nice cruise across the Atlantic with me, maybe next spring, you're welcome aboard. Just bring rum and, of course, hors d'oeuvres. So you can look it up. It's a unique vessel that, or a survivor of a vessel. Well, I'm going to show you another port here. Just we're not going to get to go there, but Saint-Malo is the next port in Normandy down south of Guernsey. This is the symbol, the great royal weasel, which is a symbol of the city. But it was a fortified medieval town run independently of the rest of France, and it was famous for issuing lettres de marque, or privateer letters. In other words, they had official piracy that would prey especially upon the English. And so this was a town that withstood all kinds of battles because it had tremendous, again, tides, 40, 50-foot tides. And then they built a wall around the city with armaments, and it's still there. Now, this was damaged again in World War II, but it is rebuilt what damage was done, and it's quite a tremendous site with a floating harbor. Again, the ships come in to a modern port on the high tide. They close the locks, and they leave on the next high tide. But this is one of the more remarkable sites. Now, it's much more older and intact than Le Havre, but Le Havre looked a lot like this before it was so bombarded. Out of here sailed Jacques Cartier, the great French explorer, who then crossed the ocean and found the St. Lawrence River and sailed up and claimed what is now Canada for France. And he met the Algonquin Indians there, and he said, "Where are we?" And the local people said, "Canada," which in Algonquin means a village by the river, and that's where the name of Canada came from. So this is a great connection between Saint-Malo and France and, of course, Quebec and Canada. So here's a monument to the minister of Quebec who came over in the past century. And so there's still relations today, and this is part of the transatlantic culture. Here's the fortress, Hotel de Ville, the mayor's office of Saint-Malo, and large churches and beautiful markets and such you'll see elsewhere. And out the parapets and windows, you can see the ships coming and going. Now, this is another unusual vessel that was just reconstruction, the l'Hermione, his name is, which is the reconstructed flagship of the Marquis de Lafayette, who personally financed his own naval vessel to go over and help the American rebels against Britain in the Revolution. And this ship was launched a few years ago, finally last year, came on a tour of the North American ports to fly the French flag and remind people that without the French assistance, the American Revolution would have been a failure. It was the French Navy that blockaded the entrance to Chesapeake Bay for the Battle of Yorktown, for instance. And so this new reconstructed ship is a symbol of the nautical heritage of France and the relations, particularly with the United States, and quite a classic work of its period. And just speaking of the French Revolution, here's the Marseillaise. This is the sing-along portion. Are you ready? How does it go? Les enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Oh, the rest is up to you. I'm sure you remember the song. It's an original Disney tune, I believe. But the irony of this song, though, the great national anthem, is that the royalist military officer Roger de Lisle, who wrote the song to support the king, heard his own song with the lyrics changed as the revolutionary troops chased him off into Switzerland. So he was the songwriter who got pursued by his own tune. Well, anyway, this leads me on to the next rock, which, again, a little outpost off of Saint-Malo, but where we will be able to visit is symbolized by these codfish, which is the great rock, or the Mont St, St. Michael's Mount. Now, this is probably one of the most famous architectural features of this whole area because it's an old fortress from about 800 AD that was turned into a monastery, and then finally a large church was built on top, and it's had both the function of being a military outpost and also a religious center. But its feature is that it's built on rocks out on the great mudflats, where there again is such tide that you can only reach it twice a day, otherwise you're flooded out. So it was defended many times over the centuries from attacks from various forces. The British never, or the English army never captured it. During the French Revolution, it remained royalist until it finally gave in. Even William the Conqueror left it alone because he could not take that fortress. So it has had a history of being a little offshore and a little independent. But now just last 2 years ago, they built a brand new causeway, so you can go out there at leisure. The crowds that go there are such that they needed to get there full time and during the daylight hours, particularly, not get stranded. So they have a car park out on the shore, and then they have a causeway and electric shuttle buses that go out to the great rock out there, the Mont, they call it, or the mountain. And it's about almost 300 meters high. It's almost 1,000 feet high. And it has a little village down on the lower end, and then the great cathedral on the top. It's not actually a cathedral, it's just a very large church. There's no bishop there. And there are 44 residents, and the families that have lived there for centuries essentially run the little hostels and the restaurants and manage the place under tremendous amount of visitors. And most times you can't get there at all in the high summer because there are too many visitors. But it has this church on the top of the very pinnacle of the rock, and then the fortifications around the shore and the village. And it's a lot of steps to get up and go around and look at the old fortifications with their stone cannonballs and views of the town from above. And it's really a medieval wonder, this whole place, and on the UNESCO World Heritage List, certainly. And then in the very center it has this cloister, so the very top of it is very peaceful. And that is St. Michael, the Archangel, up on the very top of the church. Now from here I'm going to go on to the emblem of Paris, which was founded on the Seine and was in a strategic place to control the river traffic and then the surrounding land. So again, it's a city that grew from prehistoric times. There was a Celtic tribe called the Parisi in Latin, for which Paris itself is named. And now it's grown into a large village with about 11 million people in the metropolitan area, and is very much the capital of France. It's the political capital, the economic capital, the cultural capital, and many other things are all combined into this great city. And I'm not going to go on with a great deal of detail just because it's such a large topic, but I'll just give you just the highlights if you haven't been there. If you haven't been to Paris, it's like you haven't been to the center of the world. At least the Parisians will tell you that. And the Seine winds its way through the town. The districts spread out. There's a great deal of suburbs now, of course, what they call the banlieue. But the heart of the city is still well preserved with mostly beautiful buildings from the 1800s and then monuments. The big green areas are the great Bois de Boulogne, Bois de Vincennes, and Versailles is outside of this particular map. But the whole city is divided into what they call the arrondissements, which are the different neighborhoods. And so you can identify the left bank, right bank of the Seine. Usually on the right bank were the commercial center and the, let's say, the uptown, fancier parts of town. The left bank was very much industrial and then bohemian, famous for its many artists in that area. So there are many, many features in these various parts of Paris. But the Parisi actually were quite remarkable. The people who lived there, they minted these gold coins in about 100 BC for trade with the Romans. And when the Romans got gold coins from northern France, they decided not to trade, they would conquer. And of course they came and marched in and took it over and continued on their way to conquer Britain. But these are the oldest archaeological evidence of Paris, are these gold coins. Very stylish, the lady's hairdo. Notice that? Well, anyway, Paris grew, and on and off was the capital of France. Of course, modern France is an amalgamation of many other smaller kingdoms that were finally unified into one nation. But in medieval times, it had city walls around the Ile de Cité, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and the city walls, though, were all torn down to build the big boulevards that they are now. In the late 1800s, they were all finally demolished. But there was a castle right in the center of town, which was the military fortifications for the royal family, de la Bastille. And this is the great storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, which began the French Revolution. Now that castle has been demolished, alas, but you can see what size it was before. But that began the era of modern France, and Paris grew prosperous between the wars because it had an extensive international trade and empire. And this is one of the artists' view of Paris in a previous century of Pissarro, the Boulevard Montmartre. And the life in the neighborhoods is really the characteristic of Paris, because you have, it's a deeply urban place, people living in walk-up buildings about 6, 7 stories, lots of shops along the way, lots of boulevards, lots of parks, lots of cafes. And so if you have the time after you've seen some of the great monuments, the thing to do is, of course, sit in a cafe and listen to people chatter away. Now here's a painting of Renoir at the Moulin Rouge, again, the late 1800s. And so this is sort of a fabled period of artistic activity in Paris. And so Paris had considered itself the center of the culture, the center of music and art and literature, and it's had trouble sort of keeping up that reputation in modern times. But this particular era was a time of great charm and pleasure, let's say, in France and Paris in particular. And as it modernized, it was the first city to put in electric streetlights, and that's where Paris got its name as the City of Lights, because it was illuminated for the first time in human history at night, which of course added to the nightlife. But today it's very busy, let's say. Paris, like London, is now many immigrants, many visitors, and so it's busy as can be, busy as ever. They now have the Seine with river cruises. They've even put beaches along the side up above the river, so you can lie on the beach in the summertime right around the Ile de Cité. That is the original center of Paris, and the old fort that fought off the Vikings. Now it is left over mostly to the great Cathedral of Notre Dame. And a few people live in there. I once visited a friend who was living in that very building, and they had an apartment about the size of this theater. But of course they'd been there a while, I guess is what you could say. Here's Notre Dame in its beauty. There was more spires, but they burnt down. So this is just the cut off spires. But this again dates from about 1200 AD when they started to build it, and is the symbol of Paris along with others. The Arc de Triomphe, built to commemorate the victories of Napoleon. And of course, this was the great memorial arch that Hitler drove through later. And he ordered it, as the war was winding down, he ordered his general Clausewitz to blow this up. He did not want this remaining, but the general refused. So it remains to this day. And after de Gaulle came back, leading the Free French forces, they of course had their parade through the Arc de Triomphe. And here he is, the great Charles. And so New France has, survived too many wars and too many troubles to become the, let's say, the proud nation that it is today. And in Paris, it just exudes pride and elegance and beauty. Now, this is the Palais Garnier, which is actually the Paris Opera House, in a style that is unmatchable these days, this kind of gilt and elegant decoration, which many, many buildings of they call the Grand Siècle, or the Great Century of building, where the Paris in particular had incredible, elegant architecture built, and often it was just residential and the pride of the city. This is the Palais Royal, which was the downtown offices of Louis XVI. Now it is the Conseil d'État, which is the national council, sort of the presidential offices. Here's the Hôtel de Ville, which is the mayor's office. So these buildings are in beautiful shape, and Paris, like London, has cleaned up its environment, and it's no longer choking on smog, or the streets are clean, and things are quite in good condition these days after some of these buildings had a lot of neglect over time. Now, this is the Great Louvre, the world's largest museum, which was formerly royal quarters in town for the offices of the government. And the pyramid, which is a new entrance built by the Chinese-American architect I.M. Pei, is now the pyramid that you go in to enter in and then go see the many galleries. And again, this is a very busy place with millions of visitors to go see the great winged Diana, and also the Mona Lisa and other great works of art are in there. And hope you can, if you've never been in the Louvre, you have not seen classical art yet. Then there's the modern Paris, which is typified by the area called La Défense, which is the largest commercial office area of France and also of all of Europe. And so this is a new district that was planned about 30 years ago, just so that all of this, let's say, big glass boxes and modern facilities could be in one area and not tear down any of the classic city. It's at the end of the Champs-Élysées. Here's another unusual building called the Centre Pompidou, after the prime minister who proposed that there be a very large art center, theater center, and the curiosity of this was that it was the first time that a building was built with all of its staircases and plumbing on the outside. And so this was a shock to the Parisians, particularly since it tore down the great Les Halles, the great food market right downtown, a big wrought iron structure designed by Eiffel himself, Gustave Eiffel, and it was replaced with this modern building, but it is a very busy cultural center for the city of Paris. Other one's a new Opera Bastille, on the site of the former castle. It sort of looks like a castle, but that's for modern opera and productions rather than the Paris Opera, which is purely classical opera. And there's a lot to see and a great deal of fervor in the town. Now, this is one of the great gatherings of the Parisians at the Place de la République. And, of course, you know the trouble of the times, the terrorist attacks and such that have wrenched Paris and France, but have also increased the determination to maintain their lifestyle and their liberties. And this is the slogan you'll still see painted around town now, Je suis Charlie, which refers to the massacre of the editors and cartoonists of the journal Charlie Hebdo, which is a kind of a racy magazine, but it was attacked because it made cartoons in fun of those who got so upset at be driven to murder. So Paris is a survivor of its troubles, and also it maintains a certain joie de vivre, a certain pleasure, and you know the cafes are open, and the city quickly recovers from its wounds. And then there's this. Now I'm going to just continue on with focusing on the Eiffel Tower, the Tour d'Eiffel, it's called in French, because this is the great landmark of Paris, other than, let's say, the older buildings. Now, when this was built to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, 1889, it opened up. And when it was proposed, it was hotly debated because they said, why are we putting this monster up in the middle of our beautiful, elegant town? Well, it was the idea of Gustave Eiffel, who was a designer of buildings and bridges and a master of structural engineering in wrought iron and rivets. That was the technology of the time. And he said that Paris was such a great city, it should have something worthy of, let's say, even the pyramids, but even bigger. So his vision was finally approved to be temporarily part of an exhibition. And it was built to these scale plans. See, it's much larger than the Statue of Liberty, which, by the way, was a French production that was given to the United States. But this was very audacious at the time, that nothing had ever been built this high, much less with that technology. And so they began the construction, and it used 7,300 tons of girders, all assembled at a factory out of town, brought in. They used 2.5 million rivets. And as it was being built, people were astonished, and they couldn't believe that it would even stand up, and they didn't understand the engineering to realize that this would be so large. There was a committee of artists led by Gilles de Maupassant, the writer, who called it monstrous, ridiculous, and a barbaric crushing and a humiliation over all our other beautiful monuments, and a hateful shadow of the hateful columns of that bare metal will loom over our city forever, which is true, it's still there. But when they built it, they didn't even know how to get up it, so they had to go talk to Mr. Otis in the U.S. to design the first recreational elevator that is still working there. And so then they could take people up, and then it became a great popular hit. And when the exposition opened, it was the glory of the world, unbelievable, incroyable. And Then it was supposed to be just part of this temporary exhibit, and the city was going to tear it down in 1909 and sell it for scrap. But by that time, so many people were coming to see it, they decided to let it continue. And then again in World War II, this tremendous ironwork was slated to be demolished by Hitler. But again, his own general refused to destroy it, partly because it has such beauty of its era, this wrought iron. The names of many of the engineers are inscribed on its side. And it very much became the symbol of the city. Here's some American GIs passing there. The French flag is just put up on top. In 1957, they extended a broadcast tower onto it, and it was used to broadcast radio signals all the way to the Americas and around Europe. So it's a little higher than it was built. But it looms over Paris. And one artist who said, "I hate the sight of it. I go out in the street. You can see it from everywhere in Paris, and it's like a big creature that looms over the city." But most people think it's quite fantastic, which it truly is, to the point where you have to stand in line quite a while to get in. They've installed new high-speed lifts to get up it. But last year, there were 7.9 million people who went in, the most visited building in the world. And of course, it's almost more than 100 years old, so they continue to make sure it's structurally sound. And they have restaurants and viewing platforms. There's even an apartment for Mr. Eiffel that's still up there that you can go see. So this is the French restaurant, Altitude, a good name for one up there. Sort of like the World Trade Center in New York, but quite fantastic because you can walk around and look at this structure. So it's a sort of an example of the survival of the French people. The last time it was almost lost was in 1967, where the Prime Minister of Canada proposed to the French government to buy it and disassemble it and put it up at the Montreal Expo. Well, when this got into the Parisian papers, once again, it was saved and kept where it is. So it is a real symbol of the city that's now repeated in places like Las Vegas and Tokyo, and you can buy your very own model of it if you want one. But it's still a tremendous sight that is the symbol of Paris and the endurance of France. And on Bastille Day, they light it all up, so it's quite a fantastic sight. Well, with that, I'm going to just say bienvenue à la France, welcome to France, and I'll leave you with a couple of other sayings just because I've enjoyed this trip with you, and it's been quite remarkable to go around the British Isles and then have France as a bit of dessert, right? And it just reminds me of a couple of sayings I'll leave you with, one of which is the old saying, "I have seen more than I remember, but I remember more than I saw." So I hope I've shown you things you didn't get to see, or you are interested, you come back to these many places we've been. And I'll also leave you the saying that this is actually an old Roman saying, that those who cross the sea in a hurry do not change their spirit, which is why we're taking it easy and relaxing on a ship. And while you're on a ship, the best things you can see, the best ships you'll ever find at sea are your new friendships. And I hope you've made a few of those. And the last saying, which actually goes back into Phoenician times, is the time spent at sea does not add to your age ashore. So the longer you're on board, the younger you get, especially this ship. Anyway, with that, thank you very much. My pleasure to sail with you, and bon voyage.